Hey guys, Ellen here today to talk to you about my final project, which is actually centered around the Salem witch trials. I think it's one of the more interesting stories in early American colonial history. It happened in Massachusetts between February of 1692 to May of 1693. 200 plus people were actually accused of being witches or being involved in witchcraft, and of them, 19 were actually convicted and they were executed by hanging. So it's a pretty violent period in American colonial history, but in addition to that, it's kind of an interesting one because there are a lot of differing theories on why in fact this happened, where it happened, and when it happened. So the history of witch trials and the belief in witchcraft goes back actually to Europe. There were a lot of witch trials that happened in European history, and it kind of began or was propagated to a large extent by the book Malleus Maleficarum. It was published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, and it was a treatise on witches and the prosecution of them, and it really strongly affirmed the idea that if people were witches, that is tantamount to heresy, and as a result of that, execution was the appropriate punishment for that type of behavior. But by the time that the witch trials actually happened in early American history and colonial history on this continent, witch trials had largely faded out of popularity in Europe. It wasn't something that was largely done anymore. It had something that had really ended in Europe. And that's kind of what makes it fascinating, is there are a lot of differing opinions as to why it happened. So essentially, a group of girls began behaving strangely, and a local doctor ruled that they were bewitched. And then, as a result of this, the girls then accused a local slave, Tituba, of actually being a witch and bewitching them, and a couple of other women who were involved with this. So Tituba was a South American Indian slave, and she would ultimately confess to witchcraft. But it's part of the reason that this has so many layers to it is because she was an ethnic minority in that region and also a woman. There's a lot of gender studies that goes into it, and there's also a lot of racial studies that go into this particular event in American history. But there are also a lot of other things that were going on in Massachusetts around this time frame that probably factored into it. So King Philip's War had happened between 1675 and 1676, and it was a war between the colonists and the Indians, and there was a lot of bloodshed, and it was really like a dark period in colonial history. But also there was a continued perpetuation of the idea that witchcraft and providence were all kind of intertwined, which is really what my paper is focusing on, which is Puritan theology and how that factored into the Salem witch trials. So Cotton Mather actually published, and he was a preacher, he published Strange Phenomena of New England in the 17th Century Salem Witchcraft. And this was a book that he published prior to the actual Salem witch trials, or the most well-known witch trials. And in it, essentially, he describes a bunch of phenomena that seem to point to witchcraft or that kind of behavior, interactions with Satan, the devil, the occult, those kinds of things. So like I said before, there are a lot of differing opinions on why, in fact, the Salem witch trials happened, and a lot of historians have actually looked at it through a bunch of different lenses. And I already talked about a couple of the most popular, but gender, societal, warfare, and racial are a lot of the really important lenses that this event's actually looked through. And so I decided to kind of vector myself out of maybe those interpretations and instead decided to focus on a very small subset of information, which is actually looking at Puritan theology and Calvinist providence theory and why that factors into Salem witch trials. So providence theory is something that arises from Calvinism and the idea of predestination. So if things are predestined, that everything that happens in life is something that is designed by providence, and therefore it has a reason. It's either caused by God or it's caused by the devil, but no matter what happens in life, it is completely outside of the control of man. And why that's important is because Puritans largely believed that God had a hand in everyday things that happened in their life. And so what that meant was that if God can interact with the physical world, then so can the devil. And because the devil can interact with the physical world, the possibility of people like signing blood oaths with the devil, the possibility of people bewitching other people, were actually really common parts of Puritan faith. So you had Puritan faith, and then there were kind of allowed beliefs outside of that, and one of them was in witchcraft. And also in Puritan culture, there was a lot of counter charms too. So people believed strongly in bewitching, in hexes, in those types of things, and so they also looked towards counter charms to essentially ward off those things. I'm going to get into it a lot more in my final project, but I wanted you guys to understand that Puritan theology absolutely plays a huge role in the Salem witch trials. A lot of different historical interpretations, and what I'm trying to do in this project is to really pare it down to a singular partial cause. I'm not going to say that Puritan theology, by any stretch of the imagination, was the full cause of the Salem witch trials, because it wasn't. But at the end of the day, it was definitely a contributing factor to why they happened. I hope this was informative. You can definitely click on the links and read some of the articles that I've read on it if you guys are interested in reading about Puritan theology and its interaction with the Salem witch trials. If not, I hope that this is at least somewhat informative to kind of the way that society worked when this event happened. Thanks. Bye.